Everybody, and welcome back to part two of our 1960s recorded session. I just want to let you know that yes, I understand with it being like the first week back and everything. I've heard it from some students, I've heard it from some teachers, heard it from some parents, hearing it from everybody that it's been tough. It truly has. I've been having to learn so much, so many things that are new. You have parents are at home with you guys trying to figure it out, and everyone's just having a difficult time with it. So with that being said, on Friday, I'm not going to assign anything new for this class. You can use that time on Friday to catch up on work for this class, catch up on work for another class, and just kind of reset yourself to begin again all next week. The format of this class, again, just keeping it pretty simple for the most part. Have some video lectures like this, have some videos, so on and so forth. It's so hard to upload stuff on Microsoft Teams. It's been crashing a lot. Just trying to keep it simple for all of us as much as possible. And again, if you have any questions, email me, message me on Remind, get in touch with me ahead of time before it's too late. Yes, I'm being a little bit more relaxed on due dates and when stuff is due, but if 2 weeks later students are like, hey, I didn't do that thing from week one, that's too bad. You didn't talk to me or anything like that, but you are getting extra time. Use it wisely, take advantage of it. I've been getting students today asking me questions about stuff that should have been done last week or on Monday. Trying to work with you, but remember, earlier is always better. So to continue with what we were working on yesterday, we got up to the Vietnam War. That's what we're going to look at today. Specifically, we're going to do all of heading number 2. And at a later date, probably on Monday, after that lecture or after that video, I'll assign your questions and answers for these notes. Just keep up with it. So without further ado, here we go. So where we left off yesterday was starting in 1965, the war in Vietnam really starts to escalate for the United States. Well, not many Americans really knew where Vietnam even was. They knew that maybe it was in Asia, but why did we end up getting so involved in a small country that Americans didn't really know about? Well, here's a joke for you. Americans learn geography through war. The only countries that we know about is if we went to war against them or actually went there. So America learned where Vietnam was. I usually like to start backwards with showing you the Vietnam War Memorial. Some of you may have seen this, some of you may have even been there. If all the way down here is where the Lincoln Memorial is, Washington Memorial up here, Korean War Memorial would be over here, and then here it is. It's this large black wall. As you zoom in, you start to see that it's kind of shiny, and there's some stuff that is written on there. This was the most moving memorial that I've ever been to in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of really grand structures, really nice architecture for some memorials, but this one, I guess you could say, kind of hit you right in the feels. Because here's why. As you zoom in on it, and as you get closer, you realize that there's names up there. And all right, if it's a war memorial, you realize that these are probably the guys that died in the Vietnam War. Correct. You would think that they would be in alphabetical order, but they are not. They are actually in order. If I was able to zoom all the way back and go back, they're actually in order chronologically of when they died. So if you go and take a look at the very first name, that is the first guy that died, then you walk all the way to the end, you've passed about 55,000 names, and then you can look at the very last guy to die in the Vietnam War, and it's a very, very moving war. So I just mentioned 55,000 men end up dying in this country over here where most Americans didn't even know where it was. What got us in here? What made this war escalate so much for us? I can't have a lecture without a coffee mug. So Vietnam is right down here. You have Korea here, Japan, and Communist China right up above it. Well, little backstory is that Vietnam was independent for a bit, but in around the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, the French end up colonizing what would be known as Indochina, French Indochina. You have Vietnam, you have Laos, you have Cambodia, and so the French were in charge all the way up until World War II. So in World War II, the Japanese end up invading Indochina and they end up kicking out the French. The Vietnamese really kind of band together to fight against the Japanese. And when the Japanese lose and the Japanese are out and the Vietnamese have gained some sort of independence when they came together against the Japanese, do you give the Vietnamese their own country back? Year is 1945 and the Japanese have been pushed out of Vietnam. What should we do with Vietnam? Do we give them their independence and end French colonialism because we're against empire building all the way since World War I? Or do you support the French and pay for a French war against communist Vietnam? I didn't mention that before. Yes, we love people forming their own country and having freedom, but the people who were really able to unify Vietnam against the Japanese had a communist background. A gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh, you're going to hear his name a lot. He had a communist background. He visited Russia. He visited communist China. And they're the ones that actually support him. So of course he went a little bit more communist, but when he was talking about freedom for his country, all we saw was red, and we were not going to have that. So we supported the French. So here's heading number 2, the Vietnam War in the 1960s. The Vietnam War is in basically a tale of two halves. The first half is in the end of the 1960s, and the second half is in the beginning of the 1970s. We're just going to take a look at the 60s. So this picture down here is of Ho Chi Minh. He is the leader of North Vietnam and the communist movement in the North, and he wants to unify Vietnam, but we're not going to allow it because he has that communist background. So, do we support Vietnamese independence? Nope. Ho Chi Minh looked a little too communist, so we end up supporting the French when they try to regain colonial control over the Vietnamese. So, do write this. You just don't have to write this line. So, Vietnam resistance leader Ho Chi Minh leads the fight against the French. So, for about 9 to 10 years, the French move in again right after World War II, and they try to reestablish their dominance over the Chinese, or over the Vietnamese. But the Vietnamese have fought against the Japanese, have fought against the French, have fought against the Chinese. It was just another independence movement, and the Vietnamese it was another person that they had to fight against. So they did. And it all came down to this battle right here called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the French surrendered, and it was the last battle, and the Vietnamese independence movement ended up winning. But to the United States, it was the communists that won, and were we able to allow that to happen? So in 1954, the North goes communist, the South goes democratic, and there's supposed to be free elections starting in 1954. Both sides wanted to unify both ends of Vietnam, but could we really allow the possibility of the North making all of Vietnam communist? That answer is going to be no. Okay, what led to the U.S. fighting the Vietnam War? We paid for most of the French fighting in Vietnam from 1945 to 1954. We paid for about 80 to 90% of the fighting for the French to do that. So we're already heavily invested. If there's anything that America likes more than winning or likes more than independence, is money. So we had to make sure that this money that we spent was going to be spent wisely and it didn't go to waste. So when the French are out, we got to make sure that it's worth it. We also believed in something called the domino theory. If one falls to communism, they all fall, so we have to stop it now. We believe that if Vietnam ended up falling to the communists, Laos would be next, Cambodia would be next, Thailand would be next, and then, heaven forbid, if India fell to communism, we just could not have that. So, how do you stop all the dominoes from falling? You stop the very first one from falling. Next, we believed in democracy, and we had to support our allies. If we just let a country fend for itself and they're our ally, what message would that be sending to the rest of our allies? Well, we had to make a good example of this, and we had to back up South Vietnam because we had to look strong for all of our other allies that we have their back. And then next, We completely underestimated the enemy. We beat the Nazis. We beat the Japanese in World War II. The Vietnamese to us were a bunch of people running around in the jungle just with AK-47s. So if we could beat the Nazis, we could beat the communists in North Korea, we could beat the Japanese in World War II, what are a bunch of people running around in the jungle with AK-47s going to do to us? I'll give you about 55,000 examples of what they're going to do to us. It's not going to end well. We completely underestimated our enemy. Again, feel free to pause this as you wish. Here's the domino theory. If Vietnam falls, all of this will fall too. How do you stop it? You don't let the first one fall. So, the North Vietnamese had a regular uniformed army. It looked like a regular army. They had their uniforms. It looked like a regular army. But what also worked with the North Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese army is that they had a guerrilla force in the south called the Viet Cong. These looked like regular civilians. They were basically like the Taliban insurgency that I guess you could say. You couldn't tell them apart from the regular civilians. They led ambush attacks, guerrilla warfare, and these were the people that were doing a lot of the fighting in the South, and it gave us a big headache later on. But again, they were just a bunch of people running around in the jungle with machine guns. What was that to the United States military during this time? So the Viet Cong, they're the South Vietnamese Communist guerrilla forces allied with the North Vietnamese army. In 1963 is when they started. They ended up revolting against the South Vietnamese president and started a guerrilla war in the South against the United States and South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese president was a very unpopular guy. He was actually Catholic in a country that was a vast majority Buddhist, and he actually started discriminating against the Buddhist population. Very unpopular. He was very corrupt, was not a good leader, and the South Vietnamese military generals were like, hey, we're going to end up assassinating this guy. And the United States was like, we're just going to go look over here real quick. And we turned back and, oh my God, he's assassinated. Oh no. Well, that had bad repercussions. If their leader is dead, who's going to step in? We had to step in even more. So this is not starting off on a good footing for us. So we end up sending our special forces there to train the South Vietnamese to do the fighting. But once the Viet Cong really get underway, the South Vietnamese army and how we're training them just really is not cutting it. So what happens in about 1964 is that we have one of our warships in very close to North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it is attacked. We don't know if this actually really happened, but anyways, it was attacked by a couple North Vietnamese boats, and because we were attacked, Congress ends up giving the president unlimited power, complete unchecked power to stop North Vietnamese aggression just because a couple of boats attacked one of our boats. And with that, the president rapidly escalates Vietnam into a full-scale total war. We go from just training the South Vietnamese army with about 1,000 men, and in about 4 years, we have 500,000 men in Vietnam leading a full-scale war. So escalation, just about a year after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there's 180,000 troops that are sent to Vietnam, and just 4 years later, there's 500,000 men in Vietnam. Before we really started to before we really put boots on the ground and sending our men out into the field, there's something called Operation Rolling Thunder, where we tried to bomb the Vietnamese into submission. And there's 3 times as many bombs dropped on Vietnam than there was in World War II. So in that small country, in a span of a couple years, we dropped more bombs on Vietnam than 3 World War IIs combined. But because of this, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong only grew stronger because our tactics killed a lot of civilians. It was very indiscriminate. And again, we were just another country that they're fighting for their independence for. This was not necessarily a communist movement. We were fighting against an independence movement. They were fighting for their freedom. That's a very tough enemy to fight against. Here is the Gulf of Tonkin. That is where one of our warships was fired on. A lot of people think that the president escalated this war way too quickly and way too much for just getting one of our boats shot at. And here's South Vietnam here. So the nature of the war. The Viet Cong guerrillas gave the US soldiers many problems because they were not a regular uniformed army. Think of it as like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. They blended in with the civilians very easily. Think of a soldier walking into a village or walking out into the jungle. You have no idea where your enemy is. Your enemy could kill you at any point in time. You have no idea where those bullets are going to come from. So we had a very tough time figuring out who exactly the enemy was. And this led to a lot of problems with US soldiers and a huge mental strain on them too. You just never knew where the enemy was and where the bullets were going to come from. And as you'll see later, they had thousands of miles of tunnels dug all throughout South and North Vietnam that if there was an ambush and you go chasing after them, they literally just disappear into the jungle. So here's a little exercise for you that I do in class. Pretend that you're on patrol, you're just walking right here, and you get a report from the guys behind you, the radio operator, that the enemy is in the area and is about to attack you. You're looking at these people. The Viet Cong blends in perfectly. What do? Do you stop these people? Do you go search that village? Do you just keep walking and then they pull out their guns and shoot you right in the back? Do you shoot them right now immediately? A lot of students usually say just mow them down. Well, usually what ends up happening is that for every one person that you kill here that was innocent, their family members are going to join the Viet Cong. And how do you stop something like this from happening? Huge mental strain, and it created a ton of stress on our soldiers and on our military. Booby traps. Whew, out in the jungle, man, this is the stuff that stopped the United States military, something that I could go to Home Depot with $10 and build. So this right here is a trap door. Our soldiers are out in the forest, out on patrol, chasing after the enemy. This trap door opens up, our soldier falls down, there's spikes right there. Usually these spikes were poison tipped, sometimes they had feces on them. But here's the thing about these booby traps. It was not meant to kill the person that this happens to. No. If you go out on patrol with 10 guys and one of them dies, the other 9 can still move on. But if one of these booby traps ends up injuring one guy, he is yelling and screaming for dear life. The other 9 guys are starting to get freaked out, huge mental strain, and it takes 2 to 4 of the other guys to get that injured guy out and take him back to the helicopter. So without killing them, if the Viet Cong just injured one of our guys with one of these booby traps, okay, it would take 4 other guys away, and now you're only left with 6 that can move on. These booby traps were not meant to kill our men, they're meant to injure them, so the psychological warfare would be a huge strain, and also too, that it would take more men off the field because they got to get that guy back to the medevac helicopter. Well, you go chasing after them, and they literally disappear into these underground bunkers. You can see here there's a firing post, airtight trap door, first aid post, sleeping chamber, meeting rooms, storage, and these were very hard to weed out. The enemy could just literally disappear. So if you're one of these soldiers, the mental strain is just absolutely tremendous on you. So the environment was very tough for US soldiers. There was a lot of rain, there was a lot of humidity, there was a lot of heat, It was a tough, tough, tough time on them. If you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We've been through every kind of rain there is. Little bitty stinging rain and big old fat rain. And sometimes it just seemed like the rain came straight up from under the ground and then one day it stopped. And when the rain stops in the movie, they start getting fired at. It was a tough, tough area. So let me ask you this. How do you defeat an enemy that you can't see? We dropped tons of napalm. Is that jelly gasoline? If you can't see them because the trees were so thick, just burn the trees down. How do you think about the Vietnamese? How do you think the Vietnamese felt about this, that we were doing this to their country? Agent Orange, this is a chemical that we would spray on their crops to kill their food source, that we'd spray on the trees because they just hide in the jungle and we couldn't see it with aircraft. It sounds pretty innocent, but no, this is a chemical that a lot of our soldiers were subjected to, and it breaks down your nervous system, breaks down your brain function, it breaks down your muscle control. And we have a lot of veterans today that were affected by this, and a lot of our very own soldiers that are still going through this today. So the war was not about gaining land, it was about killing as much of the enemy as possible. We quit the war when we lost 55,000 men. It's estimated that the Vietnamese lost 1.3 million men. This war was about killing as much of them as possible, and we did that, but they never quit. They never quit. We would land with these helicopters, which were loud as heck. Our soldiers would go out, kill as many as possible, hop back in, and leave. It was never about gaining land. It's just about killing as many of them as possible. But this is an independence movement. That's hard to break. So it did not wear the enemy down, it only wore us down. We go into a village, we search, we find the enemy, we don't find the enemy, maybe one or two of our guys die, we pack up and leave. The enemy just comes right back. Why would you want to risk your life for something like that? So Americans at home and soldiers are told that our commanders see the light is at the end of the tunnel. It is almost done. It is almost done. It is almost done. But as you can see, people stop believing that as much as possible. Because if the light is at the end of the tunnel, shouldn't the Vietnamese be quitting at some point in time? And they see that television is possibly telling a different story. We could be winning the war, we could have, but is this how people want to win the war? Americans didn't have the stomach for it. So if you take a look at this, our bombing is going up, and then all of a sudden it starts going down. Look at the year. Vietnam War deaths, they're going up because we're getting more involved. Then it starts going down. Look at the year. Our troops in Vietnam gets ramped up. We're at over 500,000 by 1968, and then it starts going down. Let's take a look at what happened in 1968. So in 1968, there's the Chinese New Year called Tet. And for the holiday Tet in 1968, there was a ceasefire between the United States, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. We thought by this time the United States had broken the will of the Viet Cong, but we were absolutely wrong. This enemy that was on the verge of defeat. We see the light at the end of the tunnel. The war is almost over. Out of nowhere, on January 30th, during the ceasefire, the Viet Cong launched a surprise attack on dozens of US bases in the south and dozens of cities in the south, all the way down here. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese made it all the way down here, and out of nowhere, they completely surprise attacked us at all of these bases and all of these cities at once. How could an enemy do this if they were almost defeated? This blue line right here is a Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong use this trail in these neutral countries, to resupply themselves. But then out of nowhere, this attack happens, and Americans see it happen on TV. So in the end, the United States and the South Vietnamese beat back the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. The Viet Cong were not able to take control of one military base or one city. We won. But television showed a different story. It showed that the communists were actually far from being beaten. And this is what winning looked like. This enemy that was on the verge of defeat. So we end up winning militarily, but we lose politically in the United States, and people back home do not want anything to do with this war anymore, but it will still drag on for another 6 years. So American political and social support for the war dramatically falls, because how could an enemy that is almost defeated stage an attack like this? Remember, they're fighting for their independence. This picture right here is what turned the tide of war. You saw this, or you will see this in the video that I'm going to post later on called Unpinned, is that this man right here is executed on TV. If you look at this picture, it looks like a regular civilian that is being executed in the middle of the street. If you're an American back home, you get home from work at 6 o'clock, you have the news on, you're eating your meal, and you just see this guy kill this guy, you're like, this is what we're supporting over there? This is what we're doing, killing innocent civilians? Well, here's the story behind this. This guy was a part of the Viet Cong. He was trying to kill this South Vietnamese, our ally, police chief, and his men. He ends up executing him right in the middle of the street for doing this. So this is our ally, this is our enemy, but is this how we want to win the war? This happens very quickly in your video. This guy does get executed and you see this, but this image is the turning point of the war, because is this how we want to win the war in Vietnam? We'll see. So I'm going to stop here for today. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Make sure that you're taking these notes. If you do have any questions, do let me know, and I'll let you know when I'm going to assign the questions and answers and summary to you. But if you have any questions, do let me know. I wish you guys the best of luck. And remember, Friday, basically a free day. Use that time wisely to get caught up on everything. And I wish you guys the absolute best.